Hitting on the right running back can make or break your league. So I'm bringing you 5 must-draft running backs for fantasy football. It's going to be simple. I'll let you guys in on the video right now. It's going to be Breece Hall, Bijan Robinson. I'm just kidding. Those guys are at the top for a reason. But starting off with my first must-draft running back, it's going to be Travis Etienne for the Jacksonville Jaguars. And when I look at Travis Etienne, I see a guy with elite level fantasy football upside. The main reason I see elite level fantasy football upside is because we've seen it before. RB7 last year on a points per game basis was 16.6 fantasy points per game. Hear me out. He had 12 total touchdowns last year. We absolutely love that. 3.8 yards per carry and had 58 receptions. Now, what do the Jacksonville Jaguars do? They get rid of Calvin Ridley, who's a big target hog. They bring in BTJ. They also bring in Gabe Davis. So the question then arises, hey, what is Tank Bigsby going to do for Travis Etienne? Because if we actually look at his stats last year on his opportunity share, he had a high snap share, RB6 on the year with a 74% snap share. But when his fantasy football points actually started to dwindle, which was post week 8, he actually ended up having closer to like a 60% snap share instead of that overall like 75 to 80% that he had earlier on in the season. Now, the concern with that is that Tank Bigsby is now another year better in this overall Jacksonville Jaguars offense. Let's not forget they used a 3rd round pick on him last season. So I understand the worry of a guy like Tank Bigsby potentially hurting Travis Etienne's overall upside. The thing is, I think if he can continue to maintain where he's at in that overall offense, he has ultimate level upside because of the ability for him to eat. Listen, I understand we saw what happened with kind of Blake Corum and we're worried about for Kyren Williams. I don't think I'm worried about Tank Bigsby overtaking and being a more talented running back by any stretch of the imagination that's going to keep Travis Etienne off the field. And when you're able to draft him right now on the composite ADP as overall RB9, overall player 19, when last year he finished as the RB7. And honestly, I think last year he finished as the RB7 on a points per game basis and it wasn't great. So that's why I'm like, if things actually get a little bit more positive, this Jacksonville Jaguars offense scores a lot more fantasy football points as a whole offense, Travis Etienne is going to get a bigger piece of that pie. And I think RB7 is pretty much a bottom end range of outcomes for Travis Etienne, and I absolutely love his current value in fantasy football drafts. My second must draft running back for fantasy football for 2023 is going to be Mr. Achane for the Miami Dolphins. Mr. Devon, earlier on in the offseason, Devon was going off a lot higher. He was going anywhere between RB7 or RB8, but as more people have gotten back in, they're drafting a lot more fantasy teams. I would say there's a lot more worry about Devon, but I will say this. The good elite level fantasy football drafters are drafting Devon super early. And I think the fact that last year, if we look at his overall metrics, RB5 on a points per game basis, only played in 11 games. If we look at his overall injury history last year, you're going to see that he had that knee sprain in week 5, which caused him to miss 5 total games over the season. But when he was active, when he was electric, he had a 43% snap share and he still finished as RB5. Imagine if that snap share gets anywhere above 45%. Listen, they have Raheem Mostert, they have Jalen Wright that they drafted in the draft. So there is a lot of depth on this Miami Dolphins running back core, but none of that depth is as talented as Devon. Listen, 11 total touchdowns, 800 rushing yards. What if he gets 1,000 rushing yards and keeps that 11 total touchdowns? We could be talking about Mr. Devon absolutely continuing to break fantasy football, but actually being an RB3 or RB2 on a points per game basis, and you're getting him at RB11 prices. Listen to me. That's a must draft. That's a bargain shop, and that's like going to Goodwill and walking out with a Ferrari. That is why I like some Devon. He's my second must draft running back for fantasy football in 2024. My third must draft running back for fantasy football is going to be Alvin Kamara. And Alvin Kamara, if we're looking at the overall composite ADP, going off the board as RB16, overall player 48. And hear me out with Alvin Kamara too. Alvin Kamara is almost like driving off a dealership lot with a nice 2003 Porsche. You didn't have to pay top dollar for it. It looks nice. And there's going to be some people that really value that car. But when we're looking at him, he's 29 years old, going into his 29-year-old season. But last year was RB3 on a points per game basis with 17.9 in full PPR. 75 receptions, 466 yards, 180 rushing attempts, 3.9 yards per carry, and 6 total receiving touchdowns. Listen, this Saints offense is going to be bad. Is it going to be Derek Carr going to be the starter? Are they going to turn to Spencer Rattler for the future at some point? They only really have Chris Olave to throw the ball to. You got Taysom Hill, who always tends to be a top 12 tight end, but really doesn't do a whole lot in the tight end receiving game. Alvin Kamara, if he plays 13 to 15 games, which I know the last few seasons, last year got suspended, came back, played 13 games, 15 games the year before that, 13 games the year before that. So So maybe the 17 game mark is probably going to be a little bit unreachable for him just because of this injury history that we look at. Like last year, he did have that ankle sprain in week 17. He had a rib strain in week 1 of 2022 that cost him 2 games. In 2021, he had that knee injury that cost him 4 games. I understand the worry about Alvin Kamara, but listen, we just saw RB3 with not a ton of touches with a snap share that was RB33. He barely was on the field half the time. So if he can continue that, I know he's getting older, Alvin Kamara feels like a very good value when you have to take him behind a guy like James Cook or Joe Mixon, or even a guy like Rachaad White, who I really like Rachaad White. Alvin Kamara is the prototype that Rachaad White is chasing, and Alvin Kamara still outscored Rachaad White on a points per game basis last year. So he had RB9 on red zone touches. If that stays the same, I'm not concerned about Alvin Kamara. I think his opportunity share, I think his snap share, I think his overall efficiency with that receptions makes Alvin Kamara an absolute must-draft running back. My 4th must-draft running back is going to be Raheem Mostert. And I know we talked about Devon earlier. I think the same thing that we saw last year between Devon and Raheem Mostert, both those guys can absolutely flourish for fantasy football. Not because each of them are kind of injury concerned, a little bit riddled with injuries. I mean, Raheem Mostert honestly hasn't been fully healthy any season in the NFL. And we saw Devon in year 1 not be able to stay fully healthy. But if we actually take a look at this chart, the splits between their fantasy football points, what you're going to see is they really didn't hinder one another too much when they were playing together, which makes the overall upside of both of them with a guy like Raheem Mostert, who finished as the overall RB4 on a fantasy points per game basis, realistic in this second year with Devon. Now, I want to also add in a little bit of a caveat that Raheem Mostert did score 21 total touchdowns. So you're going to say to me, Caleb, there's no way that Raheem Mostert scores 21 total touchdowns. If Devon scored 11, this might be a little bit closer, like a 15-16 split. Even still, Raheem Mostert is not being drafted anywhere near that RB4 total spot. You don't even have to take him as an RB1. You get to take him as a back-end RB2 when you're drafting him at RB24. Almost an early round RB3. And I understand a lot of people are projecting Devon to be emerging as he's the younger, more explosive running back. But Raheem Mostert, if we actually take a look at his overall mileage, I saw this tweet on Twitter. When we're looking at some of the running backs that are similar to his age, I mean, yes, he is old. But when we look at the miles on his body, the amount of hits that he's taken, it's actually been less because of the way that his career started out in the NFL. So I do think Raheem Mostert, we do have to value him appropriately here at the RB24. But when we're talking about like a guy like Zamir White, who we've never really seen even put up an RB2 fantasy points per game season going ahead of a guy like Raheem Mostert, come on, guys. Raheem Mostert is a must-draft running back at value. Get him as your RB2. Get him even as your early RB3. Dude is going to absolutely pop for you and put up some fantasy ball points. And my 5th running back that you must draft for fantasy football, this is a quick video, it's a quick hitter, is going to be Nick Chubb for the Cleveland Browns. I like to draft 2 things: good running backs and good running backs in good offenses. And listen, I love some Jerome Ford. I really do. Jerome Ford, I think early on in the season is probably going to have a pretty big role, probably weeks 1 through weeks 4. But as Nick Chubb comes back off this ACL, I think it's time for Nick Chubb to eat. Listen, the idea that we have to worry about year 1 running backs off an ACL, that is true. They lack a little bit of explosion, but Nick Chubb kind of had lost that explosion. I mean, Nick Chubb, I swear he's torn every part of that knee. Like every part of both knees is like shredded. But dude still last year in the 2 games that he played, only put up 11.6 fantasy points per game, but that's because he played in 2 games. In 2022, when we look at his numbers, RB6 on a points per game basis was 16.6. I understand he doesn't have a lot to do in the pass game. I mean, 20 receptions the last 2 years. So you're going to say to me, Caleb, if that yards per carry, which has been about 5.5, like even goes down to like 4.5 or 4, just because we're assuming that explosion is not going to be there for Nick Chubb, how is he going to be able to maintain that points? The thing for me is I think Nick Chubb, when we're looking at him, if he can just even take on an elite level David Montgomery type role, or maybe Jerome Ford's a little bit more of that explosion, has that 3rd down workload, but Nick Chubb can be that touchdown dependent running back. Makes me super excited for Nick Chubb because this Cleveland Browns offense, for everyone that hates Deshaun Watson, that's fine, but they are going to be a top 15 offense in the NFL. Not only do you have Kevin Stefanski, not only do you have a top 10 offensive line, you have a very solid defense in the Cleveland Browns defense. So I like Nick Chubb projecting him and saying, hey, if I need an RB3, if I need an RB2, and he's sitting there at pick 104, like he's going in the same range as guys like Tajay Spears, going after Austin Eckler, Tajay Spears, Devin Singletary, ahead of guys like Chase Brown, Gus Edwards. Listen, I don't like drafting running backs that are coming off of major injuries. But when we get this late in the draft, you're not having to, like, we're putting Jonathan Brooks, who we've seen nothing, and honestly tore that ACL a lot later than Nick Chubb, going ahead of him in this Carolina Panthers offense, but we're discounting Nick Chubb because of the age and because of the offense. What? Question mark? I don't know. It just doesn't really make sense to me, Nick Chubb's value. So I'm must drafting Nick Chubb in 2024 fantasy football. If you like fantasy football content, hit that like and subscribe button. Appreciate you for tuning in the channel. Means the absolute world. Here are 2 more videos to tune in. Hit that like and subscribe button as I'm helping you win your 2024 fantasy football championship. I'll catch you on the next one. Peace.